Hello, everyone, and welcome to Organization, Leadership, and Decision Making. My name is Dr. Alan Dennis. I'll be your instructor for this course. The agenda we're going to go over today is there's quite a bit of stuff, so bear with me. Typically, they won't be quite as long as this, but because we're going to be doing the course and instructor introductions, it'll take a little more time. Afterwards, typically this should be a bit shorter than it will be today. So first, a little bit about me. You may have watched my welcome video. If not, no worries. Uh, Briefly, my name again is Dr. Alan Dennis. I have a doctorate in computer science from Colorado Technical University. My concentration was in advanced or big data analytics. My master's is in computer science, and my business degree was from West Virginia University, as well as my master's. I have a lovely wife and 4 adult children and 3 grandchildren. We live on a 74-acre farm in southeast Ohio. You name an animal, it's probably here, with the exception of things like pigs. Who wants those, right? So the pictures at the bottom of this slide that you can see, far left is Oliver, a Munchkin cat. To the right is the 3 grandbabies with my wife holding 2 of them, and our youngest holding the third. She's a great aunt, but not a mother yet. I'm in the middle. That's me in the funny hat. To the right is the youngest grandbaby last Christmas. This Christmas should be amazing because he is very aware of his surroundings now and fully engaged. Not that you can see it, but to the right is my wife leading a miniature horse. About me and my work. I serve as an advanced analytics architect at the company where I work. I focused on analytic environments, data platforms, machine learning, AI, a lot of things that need to be done to make those things happen. In general, my work revolves around big data because we do build software in some fashion or another, even if it's integrations of sort. Software development is obviously something I'm interested in. Also I have an interest in education, obviously not just because I teach, but it's also learning how we learn and trying to learn better. The Internet of Things is a pervasive topic as well. It comes up in a lot of the work that I do, normally leading data into the platforms or the systems that we're applying either machine learning or advanced analytics to. Artificial intelligence is obviously a core research interest of mine, machine learning, speech recognition, intelligent agents, and so on. And stream processing is a specialty that I do focus on from time to time. My dissertation centered on that topic as well. The topic was the type of errors that people make whenever they're writing the rules related to complex event processing systems. So it was very much figuring out what kind of mistakes do people make and why do you avoid them. About my day job, I work for a company called Avanade. Avanade is a joint venture between Accenture and Microsoft, jointly owned. I do serve as an analytics architect in the advanced analytics space. Do things that are primarily centered on those sort of words, so advanced analytics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so on. Below are some of the icons of the companies who I've done work for or even have worked for over the years. So quite a few, some you obviously can't see because of my picture. I talked about this a little bit in my introductory video about why I teach. Part of it is to be able to bring to the classroom real world applications of the knowledge that I've learned over the years, also so that I can continue to learn and expand what I know and expand my area of knowledge into areas outside of what I might normally do. So it's a way of kind of keep pushing myself beyond the boundaries of what I do. And it's also being able to share the gift of education, which has been very kind to me and brought a lot of nice things to me. So I'm trying to share that as well. Moving on to the course description of why are we here? And it always helps to kind of take a moment and review the key kind of words that show up inside of a course description. It helps you understand the point of the course. And you'll catch that from me a lot of the time. Asking what's the point is something that I do a lot, and it's important for you to do as well. So what's the context of this thing? Why should I care? What happens if I don't do it? And why do people focus on it? So breaking down the course description, the keywords that kind of pop out to me Obviously, there's a case study approach. That's pretty interesting. So we're going to be looking at case studies of related to this topic, and the thinking intelligently and rationally about the types of decisions that may be required based upon technology issues. So things that are relevant to technology, but it's not just technology, but it's using it effectively and making decisions in an appropriate way, so that we're not just going by our gut, but rather making an informed decision. And then it's about understanding the components and the elements of these technology decisions. So and the associated risk, not to mention that, because risk is going to be evident in every part of a business. It's a matter of how much risk is acceptable and what you can do to mitigate that risk. So we're going to definitely be kind of looking at that from a decision-making perspective. Sometimes organizations get hung up on the risk associated with a decision, not looking at the risk associated with not making a decision, which can be substantial sometimes. This is a kind of multidisciplinary course. It draws on a lot of different areas of technology, finance, security, project management, leadership, and a lot of other elements, all related to making an effective decision and also clearly being a leader within an organization. Unfortunately, every class has some amount of assignments and tests and papers and so on. This is no exception. We have to have some means of measuring how well you're understanding the concepts we're talking about. So what we'll do now is go through at a very high level and not obviously spending a ton of time on each one of these, because we've got a few weeks to do that in. So jumping right in. For week one, we're going to talk a bit about what's the difference between leadership and management. And they are distinct things, and they accomplish different tasks, and they have different priorities and different means of measuring if you're being effective doing it. So by the end of the week, you should be able to tell the difference between those two and articulate it in a clear way. Also understanding how leadership impacts the decision, and in particular in this digital space. And then you'll want to read chapter 1 out of the text. One of the things you will notice with this course is there is a great deal of reading. I've turned off the camera briefly so that we can make sure you're seeing everything that's on this slide, because it's an important slide. One of the things you have to accomplish during the first week is the University of Cumberland's plagiarism pledge. Unfortunately, plagiarism is a significant issue within some of the courses across all of the universities. To address that, one of the things you're asked to do is to review the plagiarism pledge, and you'll sign it, and you need to do so before you can submit any work. So again, the first steps, take a look at the various, the pledge itself, and you've got to sign it before anything will be graded. You need to watch the plagiarism tutorial, make sure that you understand what plagiarism is and what the consequences of it are. Take the plagiarism quiz at the link that's provided also within the course room. Then you need to sign and submit your plagiarism pledge in the appropriate spot inside of the course room, and you must do so before any activities, certainly any written activities, will be graded. So that's a hard rule. You must do so. And also, you probably want to take a look at some of the graduate writing information that can be found inside of the library. You have roughly 2 days to do this from the start of the class, after which time things start escalating, starting with emails and so on. So make it easy for everybody. Just go ahead, watch the video, take the quiz, sign the pledge, and submit it. And for me personally, I really hope that no one in this course commits plagiarism. Inevitably, every term there's a relatively large number of students that seemingly can't do their own work. So please don't be one of those students. The consequences are severe. It starts with failing the assignment. It moves up on the second offense inside of the same course to failing the course with an F. And then the university is also notified of that. On the third occurrence, you're removed from the university. So do take it seriously. I do. and it's not something that is casually done. So the simplest thing to avoid plagiarism is cite the sources you use first and foremost, and secondly, don't reuse anyone else's work. One of the things you're asked to do in this first week as well is to post an introduction of yourself. Introduce yourself, tell me something about yourself, tell your classmates something about yourself. And that way we can kind of become something more than just a name, your person, and so on. And it also can help you connect with people in a more appropriate way in a course room. Sometimes people can feel isolated in online courses. So make sure that you take the time to do that. It's not a graded discussion. It's not something that you're forced to do, but it's to everyone's benefit if you do it. The first graded discussion requires you to first of all make sure you find at least one scholarly, which basically means peer-reviewed resource that you use during your discussion. And the reason that you want to focus in on peer-reviewed scholarly sources is that it attempts to ensure a level of quality and accuracy that may not exist in other sources. Anyone can write a blog post and post it out on the internet. That doesn't mean it's truth. It doesn't mean that it's accurate. It doesn't mean that it's well written. So the purpose of a peer review process is to ensure that the quality of the materials that are being published are basically good and that they are appropriate for the community as a whole. So make sure you're using peer-reviewed and scholarly sources. Those are typically going to be things like journal articles. Books are obviously peer-reviewed because there's a review process that every book goes through, assuming it's not self-published. And then the conference proceedings is kind of the last sort of big bucket of sources. They're peer-reviewed, but to a lesser extent. So you can use them, but you want to do so sparingly because they're typically not as well received necessarily as a journal article. Journal articles are harder to get published, is what it comes down to. So the discussion prompts, and one of the things that is kind of a pet peeve of mine is don't copy and paste the prompt into your discussion response. Rather, rephrase that prompt as essentially the first sentence or the thesis statement of your prompt or your response. So take those words, turn them into your own. Don't just parrot it back and then answer it. This isn't that kind of assignment. This is something where you should take those words and then respond to them and make them your own. The prompts that you're asked to deal with are around addressing some challenges that sometimes occur with implementing change. In an organization, there's sometimes a corporate culture that is resistant to change. It may be more pervasive than just the corporate culture. It could be a cultural, in the proper sense, type of resistance to change. But basically, the ask here is to ask how you would do it, determine how differently this would be handled, thinking about management versus leadership constructs. So rephrasing that, how would a manager versus a leader address resistance to change, for an example, whenever attempting to make some sort of an organizational change or a decision? Also thinking about it from performing work. What is the difference, or how would a manager versus a leader approach performing work? Would it be the same? Would it be different? Things like what are the activities that they might engage in? What are the success criteria, and so on. So the theme here is to get you thinking about the differences between management and leadership and understanding that they are two distinct sort of disciplines. In the second week, you're asked to take a look at how change management functions within an organization. I won't go into this a great deal, but for this particular article, it's more easy to find it, or it's easier to find it using Google Scholar than some of the other mechanisms. So you may want to consider that as a means of locating. In week 2, there's another written assignment. The pattern you'll notice that emerges in this course is that it's 1 week is a discussion, the next week is a written assignment. I won't go into this a lot of detail because we'll do this again in the second week of the course. A key thing to keep in mind, most of these assignments are 3 to 5 pages. That does not include the title page. They should be in APA format. And in this case, it's asking for 5 peer-reviewed journal articles. Rubrics are an important thing for you to understand. A rubric is how you will be graded. So it is literally the secret decoder ring, if you will, of what I'm expecting or what is expected of you in this course. This is a rubric that I'll be using for this course. It's a fairly generic research paper rubric, but it is pretty good in that it outlines the parts that are important in general with a research paper and where the points should be distributed. You do want to take the time to review this on your own. And in fact, I would recommend using a rubric before you do a submission to make sure that you've covered off everything that's expected. A key concept, and we'll talk about this more in subsequent conversations, is around this concept of a thesis statement and supporting subtopics. That is the key thing whenever you start writing one of these papers, is first to get the thesis statement right. And the thesis statement is simply what's the point of your paper. So it's typically going to be derived from your assignment. The subtopics are those elements which you use to support that thesis or to address that thesis statement. Typically, they will be your headings inside of your paper. Again, we'll talk more about this later, but I wanted to introduce the concept. At this point, we're going to move into the discussion of this week's reading. A high-level outline, you're still expected to read, but we'll go through kind of the most important parts, high-level elements of the text. Moving in, we're starting off, obviously, the first bit of the book, so we're starting off in part 1, which is around contextualizing leadership. More importantly, we're starting with the first chapter, which is the nature of leadership. So after this chapter, hopefully you'll be able to tell the difference between, or be able to articulate, more importantly, the difference between leadership and management, and also be able to talk a bit about leadership theories, both in the sense of the classical sort of leadership and the more emerging trends. And then also talk a bit about how it fits into this whole global economy and some of the current trends that we're moving towards. So some of us, it might be challenging to just, what's the difference between a leader and a manager, right? But it kind of, if you take a step back, what are we trying to accomplish? And the world we live in today is a very complex and challenging world, especially for somebody who is tasked with setting the direction of an organization. So leadership can mean a couple things. It can be somebody that's providing that direction and essentially setting the course that the ship is sailing upon, or it could be somebody that is the scapegoat, the person who's blamed when things go badly, and they are sometimes identified after the fact in a convenient sort of way. So the key concept here, though, is that organizations are changing because the business world is very dynamic compared to what it might have been at one point. There is competition at an international level, not just local, not regional, not even national. It's across the entire world. And because of that, organizations have to be able to respond quickly to whatever things that are emerging that are threats to their existence. One of the things that this text does that's a little different than some is it also talks a bit about things like the pro-environmental changes that need to be made and the innovative adapting of technology to address issues. So what is leadership? That's a central question to being able to differentiate it between leadership and management, right? And leadership has been around for quite a while. We've had leaders for at least 2,000 years that have potentially even much longer than that, depending upon how you look. But the question is, well, what is it exactly? So obviously, an example, Winston Churchill during the Second World War was clearly a leader for England and had a great impact to the outcome. But that doesn't really define it, right? And so there's been lots of drive into what is leadership. Somewhat it's about, okay, maybe it's a military leader because they have the name leader, right? So maybe that's about leadership. Manufacturing obviously has had leaders that either you might could think that Henry Ford was a leader, although was he, or was he really just a good manager? That's where it gets to be an interesting conversation. So when you start talking about leadership, this is something called a conceptual framework. It's a way of providing a scaffolding or a framework with which you can discuss a thing. In this particular case, we're talking about what does it mean to be for the definitions of organizational leadership. The dimensions you kind of see here is around process, power, behavior, and the traits. And these are kind of ways of trying to figure out what it means. And I guess the key kind of thing to think about whenever you're thinking about it versus management is it's much more about influence and the traits and the behaviors that are being elicited than it is about actual day-to-day management. So for the purpose of this course, and obviously for this book that we're talking about, this definition of leadership is actually pretty concise and pretty good. The key things to break it down is process of influencing. That's a key thing. It's not just a single time that you influence, but it's not a single time that you're controlling, you're influencing the relationship of an employee, somebody that's choosing to work at an organization, and with the intent of reaching a goal. So it's a pretty compelling way of talking about it. It's about encouraging people, motivating people, directing in a way where they want to do a certain thing that is beneficial to the organization, and potentially sharing that same vision across the entire organization in an ongoing fashion. It's not a single event, it's an ongoing thing, and it's a process. It's not a single act, it's not a framework even, it's something that you continually do over time, and with the intent of reaching a goal, and hopefully that goal is aligned with everyone's intents. Another definition that's similar in many ways, and it probably actually influenced the previous definition, is that leadership is an act, and that's an interesting sort of concept. It's something that you do. It's to both in the context of cooperation and structural conflict. So that's, again, it's something that you do to get something to happen, potentially whenever it may be challenging to do so, because either people may not want to do it, or not everyone has the same vision. And it certainly, that situation affects the type of the style or the type of leadership that's going to be used. You can view it as essentially a psychological contract between essentially the employees and the people that are essentially directing them, and hopefully in turn their management. So again, a bit more of a wordy definition, but it's kind of saying the same basic thing, is that it's about getting people to do things, or wanting to do things, not just getting them to do it, but getting them to where they want to do something that is aligned with an overarching and a broad goal or agenda. Building on the things that we've been saying and been talking about, is that the leadership is definitely about a process, an influencing process, and that influencing is a key word, and both direct and indirect, with somebody that has a formal relationship within an organization. And because it is somebody that is employed, that has some benefits in a lot of ways, but it's also important to understand that there may only be a single leader, but there's probably going to be several levels of leadership within an organization. So you may have a CEO that has a very strong impact on the direction of an organization, but then you also might have an organization that has a pretty strong CEO, but they've surrounded themselves with additional leadership teams themselves, and it's going to depend upon their style of leadership. And again, the whole point of all this is about achieving a goal, and that goal typically needs to be measured so that you can determine if you actually have reached it or not. And kind of building on the same theme, sometimes it's important to think about what do managers do and what do leaders do, that helps you understand what their roles are. So a manager could actually be a leader, but more importantly, it's about their role within the organization. there may be multiple leaders and there may be less leaders. It's going to depend upon the type of organization, and it may also depend upon where they're distributed in the organization. But oftentimes, in order for to actually exert some degree of influence, you have to have a certain level of either educational level, you may have to be at a certain level within the organization, and you probably need a certain amount of respect of your coworkers. So, for example, if you worked at a very technical firm, but didn't have a degree, so maybe take an example, maybe you worked in Intel, but you had maybe a bachelor's degree, and maybe it wasn't necessarily in something that was related to electrical engineering or chip manufacturing or hardware design or computer engineering. It's going to be more challenging for you to take a high-level technical leadership role within an organization like that because of the level of education. And also, it would be very challenging if you were an intern working at an organization like that to try to come in and affect change, in part because it's not really your role, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that you can't contribute in a positive way. So a good question is, what is the role of a manager? So breaking this down piece by piece. So what does a manager do? And generally speaking, it's about control and decision during the actual execution of some activity. It's also about trying to minimize the skill requirement while maximizing management control over the workplace or the workforce. There's several different types of frameworks associated with management, and it's a field of study unto itself, as opposed to more of a leadership focus. Many organizations have started adopting or seeing the value in adopting a more diverse policy and ensuring that they've got a broad selection or diverse selection based upon gender, race, sexuality, or sexual orientation, or self-identification, and culture as well. But it is still potentially a problem because of limitations in existing organizations. As I mentioned earlier, it's possible that a manager and a leader could be something that one person can do, but generally they're viewed as being distinct disciplines, and that they are different functions and oftentimes performed by different people. So again, what is the difference between leadership and management? This is a great breakdown of those differences. So on the left column, the manager acts as a figurehead, whereas a leader establishes the direction. Managers talk to other managers. It's kind of one of the things they do, whereas leaders focus on communicating direction, and that communication isn't necessarily just to other leaders, if you will. It's communication to the entire organization. Managers are oftentimes tasked with developing their subordinates, so it's about mentorship and training them and grooming them to move up into potentially management themselves, whereas leaders are about encouraging emotion, about shaping and encouraging people to be passionate about their work. Managers plan, leaders empower others to do things that are necessary for them to achieve the goals. A manager is going to deal with conflict. They're going to come in whenever two people are having a challenge and address it and try to resolve it in some capacity, oftentimes by determining who's higher on the organization chart. Whereas a leader is about influencing. So it's about trying to make things happen the way that they feel that they should happen, or something that they feel is aligned with the goals of the organization or the project they're working on. Managers are about negotiating, whereas leaders are about challenging the status quo. It's about being somewhat of a revolutionary in the sense of not doing things the way they've always been done. Managers are going to monitor information, whereas leaders are going to motivate and inspire others. They're going to try to bring out the best in people. Managers, kind of the whole point of a manager is directing the activities of their subordinates. Whereas a leader is about modeling that direction. So it's about showing how you want it to be done, and so that somebody can emulate you to reach the goals that you're wanting to reach. Managers are also about allocating resources, whereas a leader builds a team of people and inspires them and directs them. Uh, and managers are about producing predictability. That's what they try to do, is to minimize chaos, minimize risk, and make it to where things are predictable and have repeatable and predictable outcomes. Whereas a leader is about radical change. They're about doing things that haven't been done before in a way that may not have been thought of. So you can see, you don't necessarily, it's not like we want to say you don't need managers, but they have to be within a certain context. And occasionally you need leaders to come through and shake things up and to get an organization back on track to doing things that are revolutionary versus just doing what you keep doing. It's like a process. Whenever you're applying a process to any kind of activity, what that process does is bring repeatability. If what you're bringing is a repeatable process is not necessarily a desired outcome, you probably want to take a step back and decide if that's really how you want to do what you're doing. And perhaps you should pause the use of a process until you figure out what's the right way to do it and maybe what's a revolutionary way to do it. So a bit more details on trying to compare and contrast leadership and management. A leader creates a vision and a strategy to achieve that vision, whereas managers are about execution or implementation of that vision. So they take what the leader kind of comes up with and figures out a way to make it happen. Leaders operate with emotion. They influence you through an emotional appeal, whereas a manager operates with logical and rationality. So the difference here would be, if you think of Steve Jobs, was a very articulate and emotionally driven individual. He motivated his team with that emotion, and they shared a common vision that he set. Underneath of him, he had a lot of managers to make the stuff happen that he wanted to happen, but he led through emotion. Leaders also encourage empowerment, where managers encourage compliance. And what that means is the leaders want people to be able to do what needs to be done, whereas a manager wants them to do what they want them to do. And lastly, leadership is value laden versus management is not. So at a high level, those are kind of the distinctions between leadership and management. So another kind of parting discussion around leadership and management. Leaders are, they do revolutionary things. They do innovative, never before seen, something that has not been accomplished previously, something that no one has thought to try. Whereas managers are about basically evolutions, that they evolve things in a continuous fashion to make them better, but only doing so of those things we've seen before. And it's typically not about changing the process from a management perspective, but leaders, it's all about figuring out what is the right process and having the process follow the desired goals. And perhaps it's doing things in a totally different way. So not all managers are leaders, and not all leaders manage. But you need both. And you may have somebody that can lead that isn't necessarily as part of a formal manager sort of role, but they typically need to be in some place in the organization. And oftentimes you'll find that the true leaders are at the top of the organization. A good example might be Elon Musk, when he's talking about things like SpaceX, right? He took approaches that had never been applied before in the space exploration and rocket creation space, and has brought a new level of reuse that had never been envisioned before, treating them very much as you would treat an airplane. Did something similar whenever we talk about Tesla. He took the concepts of software engineering and component construction and reuse of designs and hooking things together at a module level, and applied that to the automobile manufacturing environment. And it came up with a totally new way of doing things that hadn't been done before. And then once he set that direction, he empowered those people beneath him, his managers, to take it and run with it and apply it and empowered them in a way to where they can do things that need to be done. Once they figure out what needs to be done, then it becomes very much a machine line sort of reproducible process. And that's a perfect example of how this needs to work and does work in your successful organizations. Whenever we talk about kind of analyzing the literature that relates to um, leadership and the study of leadership, there's kind of these two broad categories that you see on the screen. One of them talks about what should a leader do. The other talks about what do they really do. So when you talk about what a leader should do, it's going to be based upon theories. It's going to have hopefully some people with some background and certainly in business and management and psychology and so on. But it's about trying to do prescriptions for improving leadership effectiveness. What they actually do is about looking at a mixture of look at the theories of leadership, analyze them to some extent, and then kind of extrapolate from that the things that are actually going on there. So it's a bit of trying to analyze and figure out what's actually happening versus predicting what someone should actually do. And whenever you also consider this kind of maps back a bit to the conceptual framework we saw at the beginning, where there are basically five major categories of leadership research. And they center around the traits of management. So what are leadership? What do these leaders actually do? What are the behaviors they exhibit? The contingencies associated with it, the charismatic and transformative characteristics, and if it's a shared versus a distributed sort of approach. So when people study leadership, there's typically a swings that occur, shifting between leader-centric versus follower-centric models that maybe introduce things that have been discussed in the past, adding some additional concepts to them. And so it's something to think about from that perspective of where we're at today. We'll probably be somewhere else tomorrow. And it is something that is evolving and continuing to go forward as we do more research. And the reality is you need both. You have certain leaders that come along that basically encourage or almost make people want to follow them. It's that charismatic sort of personality, and they can be very motivational and encourage people to do almost anything. But you also have situations where organizations are looking for someone to lead them. People have a tendency to want to follow someone. I was on vacation in a state park, and there were trails where people were walking, and there was 4 or 5 people that were going to go walk on some of these trails, and you could tell they were kind of looking for someone to lead them. And so one of the members of that party stepped forward and basically took on the role of map reader and tour guide. So even though any one of them probably could have been capable of doing that role, it's not uncommon for people to want someone to lead them. So you'll see that sort of in the research that you'll be doing through this course, is that there's kind of both schools of people of a leader-centric versus a follower-centric model. There's lots of different ways of looking at of leadership, and some of them kind of view the organization as an entire a unity of things, and there's compliance, consensus, and order, right? Another way of looking at things is not quite as bright, and it's about things like power struggles and domination and ideology and so on, and inequality even. So that's one of the things that we'll take somewhat of a look at, is things like how gender relates to leadership, power, and leadership and ideology. When we talk about being an employee, it's important to understand that whole employment relationship. It's something that gets constructed within a work organization, obviously. So people go to work for an organization, and in a free market, it needs to be mutually advantageous. So it needs to be mutually beneficial for both the employee and the organization. Anytime that's not the case, then probably both parties should take a good look at that relationship and just decide if that should be changed in some way. But generally speaking, there is an alignment. There's a sharing of interest. I like to build data platforms. My organization needs somebody that can build data platforms for clients. So there's an alignment. And I get compensated for doing so. That's what this wage effort concept is. And it's compensation. That word is actually very telling. You're being paid for your time because you're doing it instead of something else. And probably going back to the times of going from working on a farm to working in a city, in a factory, you had to be compensated for the time that you were giving up to that organization. So hence the concept of being paid for that time. And there can be some inequalities. Obviously, CEOs make a whole lot more money than maybe your intern at an organization, and sometimes substantially more. So that's another issue unto itself, outside of kind of what we'll be doing here. But again, if it comes down to the scarcity of skills and the value that leader brings to the organization, assuming the CEO is actually a leader and is setting the direction for the entire organization, it can be justified. But there's definitely this concept of balance of power between the actors involved. And we've also, and certainly in the Western world, become more concerned with this whole work-life balance. Organizations need to treat their employees reasonably well, or those employees will go elsewhere because there's a scarcity of certain skills. If you have those skills, then you're in demand and you can do that sort of negotiation. Organizations aren't typically going to do the right thing just because it's the right thing, although some may, but they certainly will if it keeps them from having to try to replace an expensive resource. And with that, we've reached the end of our first week's discussion. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, either send me an email, message, whatever mechanism works for you. That's what I'm here for, is to answer any questions that you might have relating to this topic. Again, thank you for watching, and I look forward to speaking with you next week.